I wanted to make this video because clicker training can be a really useful tool when it comes to dog training. But unfortunately, there's some misconceptions out there, or people don't really know how to get started. So consider this your clicker training boot camp. So before we get started, I want to go over a couple of don'ts of clicker training and sort of talk about some of the myths or misconceptions that people have about clickers. So clicker training is not a way to get your dog's attention, a reward in and of itself. The click always predicts a reward, but it is not in and of itself rewarding. It is not all about food. We typically use food as a reward because it's fast, it's easy, and most dogs are willing to work for food. But it's not solely about food in and of itself. If your dog isn't really into food, you can use whatever kind of reward you want. You can use a ball, a tug toy, whatever. It's all a frisbee, whatever. Whatever your dog is willing to work for, you can use that as a reward. And a clicker is also not necessary forever and ever and ever. We use a clicker to teach a behavior. As soon as the dog understands the behavior, we don't need the clicker anymore. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get on to what clicker training is all about. So the first question, what is a clicker? This is a clicker. This is just one example of a clicker. There's many different styles out there. A clicker is a tool that makes a very specific noise. This noise. Clicker training is a method of behavioral psychology where we mark and then reward very specific moments of behavior. We use a clicker to capture precise moments of behavior and tell the dog two things. Number one, yes, that behavior is right, you're on the right track, keep going. And number two, your reward is on the way. Think of the clicker like a shutter on a camera. The second you press that button down, you're capturing an exact moment in time. That's what the clicker does. It captures an exact moment of behavior. How does clicker training work? The actual mechanics of clicker training are pretty simple. The dog does a desirable behavior, you click, and then reward your dog. That's it. But before we get started actually using the clicker with our dog, we have to teach them what that noise means. Because right now, it's just an innocuous noise, it doesn't mean anything. The way we teach them what that noise means is through classical conditioning. If you've ever heard of Pavlov's dog, then you kind of already know what classical conditioning is. Classical conditioning is just pairing one stimulus with a second stimulus. In this case, we're pairing the sound of a click with some food. This teaches the dog that this noise always predicts something really good. So that way we're able to tell our dog, you're on the right track and your reward is coming. With clicker training, we typically use food as a reward because it's fast and it's pretty easy. But if you're finding that your dog isn't that willing to work for food, you can use a toy like a ball or a frisbee or a tug toy in place of food. However, I have to mention that if you think your dog isn't food motivated, you might not just be using the right food. A lot of people tend to go for those run-of-the-mill processed dog treats. Those typically aren't all that interesting for your dog. So if you're finding that they're not all that into their kibble or into working for a processed treat, try using something a little bit higher value, like bits of hot dog, cheese, or organ meat treats. These food items are going to be a lot more higher value, and most dogs are willing to work for them more than they are like a Zooks kind of style treat. Why use a clicker? You can accomplish basically the same concept of clicker training by using your voice, using a verbal marker. Myself and many other trainers use the word yes as a verbal marker. And the reason we use the word yes is because it's a pretty unique word. Your dog isn't going to necessarily hear it all the time. So if you're using a verbal marker, you can just say yes and then reward your dog in the same way that you would use a clicker. The reason a lot of trainers opt for a clicker over a verbal marker is this is a very unique noise. Your dog hears your voice all day long. It's not that unique or different to them. But they only hear a clicker in very specific circumstances. So it has a lot higher value to your dog than just your voice. Personally, I like using both a verbal marker and a clicker. Obviously not at the same time, but I like conditioning a clicker and a verbal marker because you might find yourself in an instance where you don't have a clicker on you, but you still want to communicate to your dog, hey, I really like what you just did. So in that case, having a well-conditioned verbal marker is really useful. And we'll talk about conditioning next. Priming the clicker. So the first step to clicker training is called priming the clicker. This is where we actually teach the dog what that noise means. This is where the classical conditioning comes in. So what you're gonna do is take a handful of treats, your dog, and your clicker. With classical conditioning, it doesn't matter what your dog is doing. We just want them to learn that this noise means food all the time. So all you have to do is click and then feed. Click and then feed. We want to make sure these are two separate instances. The click happens and then food happens. They don't happen at the same time. Otherwise, the meaning of this sound starts to become muddled for your dog. We want them to always know click and then food. Continue to do this over the course of a couple of minutes. Click and then treat. Click and then treat. Over and over and over. And yes, we really want it to take a couple of minutes. We really want the dog to understand what this sound means. If you want to get really serious about it, you can do this over the course of several days with your dog's meals. Instead of just giving your dog their meal in a bowl, or however else you usually give your dog their meal, you can keep their meal in a treat bag or in your pocket or something and practice just clicking and then giving them a piece of food over and over and over until their whole meal is used up. If you do this over the course of a couple days, I promise you your dog is going to have a really good understanding of what that sound means. And you can do this same process with a verbal marker. So if you're using the word yes in place of a clicker, do the same process with that verbal marker instead of a click. Practice your handling. It's really important to remember that every time you click, you have to reward your dog. Otherwise, the meaning of the clicker starts to become muddled. If it predicts food sometimes, but it doesn't predict food other times, then the value of that click is going to start to go down for your dog. We don't want that to happen. We want them to really like this sound and actively be working to try and get more and more clicks to happen. If sometimes we click and feed, but then other times we just click and there's no food, then they're not going to have as much motivation to work for the click. So it's really important that you practice your handling before you start working with your dog. Because if you accidentally click at the wrong time, you still have to feed your dog. And then you're going to be rewarding behaviors you might not actually want. And that defeats the whole purpose. The whole point is to be marking and rewarding behaviors that we want repeated. So, here's an exercise that you can do to practice your handling before your dog enters the picture. For this exercise, you're going to need your clicker, a treat bag or easy to access pocket, bits of your dog's kibble, or you can use small marbles, pebbles, or dried beans. And you're also going to need a mug or some other kind of open container. Practice repeatedly clicking, grabbing a treat, and placing it into the container. Do this over and over and over again, so you start to develop the muscle memory needed to clicker train properly. Trust me, this is really, really, really useful to get used to handling the clicker, grabbing the food, and all of that before your dog gets into the picture. Hopefully now you have a better idea all about clicker training. For an easy exercise to introduce clicker training to your dog, go check out my video on teaching a hand target. All right, have fun and happy training.